Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Kelly Shortridge and Ryan Petrich. Kelly and Ryan, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited to chat with you guys and, dive into this topic of open source software security. But for folks that don't know your background, do you mind telling us a bit about your background and what you're up to?
Sure. So I'm a senior principal engineer at Fastly, which is a cloud computing company in the office of the CTO, where I work on the future of security. And in my spare time, because I'm a hermit nerd, I enjoy thinking about how to better secure software and systems, so much so that I wrote a book about it and published it earlier this year.
I'm an SVP at 2 Sigma, where I work on developer tooling, STLC, that sphere of things. Previously, I was a CTO at Capsulate, and we built sort of Linux security monitoring and exited that startup. And in my side projects, I kind of work on like jailbreaking stuff, compilers, lots of weird hackery things. So glad to be here and talk about security.
Yeah, definitely. You both have a unique background. And, I came across this white paper and, I've read many companies, organizations' responses to the RFI from the Office of National Cyber Director, but you all put together, arguably the most comprehensive. It isn't really comments. It's a full-blown paper, chock full of, citations and resources. So I thought it was amazing and wanted to chat with you all. So before we dive into like some of the specifics and recommendations, what exactly is this, RFI from the Office of the National Cyber Director? It talks about open source software security. And then what made you all write this comprehensive response?
Sure. So I think I saw someone post about it. Might have been Bob Lord post about it on Mastodon. And I had never commented on an RFI, but when I read the topic, I just saw the headline that it was about open source security. And I was like, well, I have a lot of feelings about that. And I feel like it's always a contentious topic. And I have some experience in open source, but I had worked with Ryan at Capsulate, and I knew that he had a ton of open source projects. We'd actually collaborated on them, and that he is a major compiler nerd, and oftentimes much deeper into a lot of the low level stuff, and has been doing, I think, I don't want to speak for you, but I think you've been doing open source stuff, including the jailbreaking stuff, for many decades at this point, since you were a wee lad. So I figured us combined, especially with a lot of my economics thinking, we would come up with something that was really comprehensive and address as many of their concerns as possible. Because I think the concern that I certainly had, and I think was shared, is that it's understandable that the requesting agencies have their perspective, right? And that's why they're requesting information, because they have one viewpoint and they want to get the viewpoint of other stakeholders, especially in private industry. And if you aren't within the open source community, even if you're just a consumer of open source, you still don't quite understand the dynamics as much as if you are a contributor to open source. And if you've seen kind of a bunch of different sides of it. So I felt like we had a pretty unique opportunity to hopefully help as much as we could, help the agencies navigate how they're going to approach making the software ecosystem better.
Awesome. How about for you, Ryan? Anything to add to that, or does that summarize it pretty well?
That's a pretty comprehensive summary. Specifically for me, when Kelly brought it across my desk, I guess I had some level of fear, because from my perspective, the open source ecosystem is very healthy. It's largely working, and whenever you have governments asking for information with the expectation that they might make policy on it, I feel like it's kind of critical that they get the full context. So I thought I had a unique perspective, and thought I could provide some comments and contribute to the process, and hopefully that means that whatever policy decisions come out of it, it'll at least have that context sort of embedded.
Yeah, that makes sense. I personally was definitely really impressed with the paper, and I see some comments coming in from folks, and it was, when I shared it, a lot of folks had a great response to it too. Comments coming in here from folks who really enjoyed the paper and found the recommendations really sound and good recommendations. You kind of opened the paper talking about, you talked about fear. So it's kind of good that you mentioned that, because it talks about poisoning resilience, through misguided regulations and recommendations. Can you talk a little bit about that? Talk about the ability for regulation to stifle the open source software ecosystem and national innovation, which I think is a response many of us have and a fear many of us have, especially in the software ecosystem. So I'm curious, how do you think that can go astray, and how do we avoid that?
Oh yeah, I mean there's so many ways it could possibly go astray, right? I mean, I think both with my economics background and complex systems background, what I always think about on the econ side are like, what are the incentives, right? Because incentive schemes ultimately drive behavior, and there are a lot of well-intentioned schemes that end up having pretty terrible kind of second-order effects or negative externalities. Which we've seen, for instance, with existing compliance burdens. Sometimes it means people just like game the policy, right? They'll adhere to the compliance checkbox, and then they feel like, well, we've done security, and it's like, well, you haven't really. So we want to avoid stuff like that, right? Where it's like, sure, it'll remunerate auditors and consultants, but like, will it actually make a difference? No, that's something we definitely want to avoid. And certainly from a complex systems perspective and thinking about, there's so many different variables in the software ecosystem, so many different things that either make it work or maybe make it not work. That was important almost to zoom out pretty early in the paper, as you put it. We talk about how like, okay, but what is it we're trying to solve? And then ultimately is like, we don't want unintended behavior in software to cause some sort of socioeconomic harm, right? Especially widespread socioeconomic harm. So I feel like that thinking really got us to think about like, okay, what are, thinking ahead, like, okay, if this, let's say recommendation or regulation happens, like what would be those kind of like second or third order effects? Like how would it actually move the needle? Would it satisfy that goal of like minimizing the impact of this unintended behavior? Or is it more of like a performative security theater thing, right? Because we don't want that. So we tried to be really careful in thinking about those things and balancing that, of course, with what is actually practical. Like, because there are a lot of things you could propose that aren't really practical, and might create, like I talked about SBOMs, like it might create like tons of JSON blobs, but does that actually result in action? Not really. Does that actually result in minimizing impact? No. So it's also thinking about like what are the kind of like fewest steps to get to that outcome that we want as well. But I don't know if Ryan also has his thoughts.
No, I mean, I think that summarizes it. I don't have anything to add there.
So from your perspective, Ryan, I'll throw the next one at you first. So you also talked about, kind of the potential for open source software to be considered critical infrastructure, which is, kind of a concept I've seen floated by a couple different researchers, some who are really impressive and have some great credentials and so on. But you all talk about kind of the perils or the risk of kind of doing that designation. And you talked about the open source software ecosystem working pretty well as it is, right? So what are your guys' concerns, from the perspective of, designating it critical infrastructure and the ramifications if we went that route?
I mean, so like when I hear critical infrastructure, I think of things like roads and bridges, right? And other things that sort of keep society functioning. And I think in some ways, like software does that as well. But the open source ecosystem is not like other infrastructure. When you build a road, when you build a bridge, right, you have a contractor, you have materials that you're using to build whatever the infrastructure is, and you have sort of a like relationship with those groups. You have a financial relationship, and you also have liability and all of these other things. The open source community, it's like people are producing software that can go into critical infrastructure, but also like a whole ton of side projects. Some of it is free expression, some of it is collaboration. People have so many different development models. And I feel like saying open source as a unit is like as a whole is critical infrastructure is just a huge overreach, and it doesn't represent what this community does. And I think going back to like the government's fears, right? Like, oh, we have our software is running our society in many ways. How do we wrangle with this, right? And I think the way it kind of works with existing critical infrastructure maybe can apply, where it's like, oh, okay, you have a relationship with a vendor, right? And they have the liability, and you want to make sure that the software product, the software system that you're getting from them is secure and is understandable, and you can maintain it over time. And I think that's more what we should be looking at. We should be looking at systems, right? And doesn't mean that the government doesn't have visibility into what software is being deployed and how it's packaged and put together. But it just means that like the ecosystem as a whole isn't critical infrastructure. It's the critical infrastructure that is getting deployed that is critical infrastructure.
Yeah, I want to ask you a question, Kelly, because he brought up some great points. And there's an excellent blog. I forget the maintainer's name, but he wrote a blog essentially saying, I am not a supplier. And it seems to be the ecosystem misunderstands this pretty often. Look at software supply chain security is making demands of open source software maintainers, sending them a large list of questionnaires, or like demanding that they fix a vulnerability, or things like that. And as he points out, there's no contractual relationship there. There's no obligation. It's often used as is. You take it and you're responsible for how you use it. Do you think policymakers and even some in the community of IT and cyber kind of misunderstand the dynamics of open source software and how that works?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a huge free rider problem, right? I think actually, from seeing some of it directly, but then also knowing other open source maintainers, right? A lot of what you see is, it's interesting. It's not necessarily like, I don't know, the Fortune 500 who's using your open source and they get really like demanding about it, right? Oftentimes it's an integrator or a contractor where they want to use open source as part of the software that they then deliver to someone else, and they tend to be the most entitled. Which is interesting. And I think that's where the big free rider problem lies. Because to me, when I hear about open source, I'm like, especially in the context of government, I'm like, well, you have federal contractors, right? If they're packaging a bunch of open source together, like, shouldn't they be responsible for analyzing it and keeping it up to date and all of that stuff? Like, it's very weird. Like, you already have the relationship with them. And I think the dirty secret is that open source is a great way for those providers and a lot of software companies to cut costs and cut corners. And it's easy for them to pass the blame onto, the nerd in their basement who's just really passionate about whatever it is, right? Because there's no direct relationship there. So I almost feel like open source in some sense has been a really convenient scapegoat, because it makes sense, right? If you have huge contracts with the federal government, of course you're going to blame the open source maintainers and open source. It's not our software that's the problem. It's all of that stuff, right? And it's like, well, you're using it. Are you saying you're not responsible for your dependencies? Like, it feels a little Looney Tunes to me, right? So I think that's an important kind of angle. And I think to add to what Ryan said before too, and I know Chris, you mentioned this as well, is like, one of the beauties of open source is it's honestly just an astonishing, like, emergent feature of our world that so many people do put in free labor for this, that powers our modern society, essentially. Like, it's kind of a beautiful thing to witness in terms, like, really zooming out just in terms of like human ingenuity and kind of community effort. It's also what has enabled us to remain nimble and competitive. And I don't think that's what we want to stifle, right? Like, it's totally understandable that for critical infrastructure use cases or federal use cases, you want to ensure certain security properties, but is regulating open source going to solve that? There's a point in the paper where, because I try to always back up like my views with math and data, right? And showing like, even not Petrich, which is like, I think most people agree is like kind of the biggest cyber incident we've seen. Like, there would have to be, I think, at least 2 of those size incidents every year to even hit, I think it's 1% of the GDP value of software, like just in the United States, right? Like, the damages just aren't there fundamentally. From a national security perspective, like, you can definitely argue differently, but in that case, like, the government should be writing their own software, right? So I think it's again, thinking about like benefits and costs here, and it's just really lopsided in my view. And it's like, is it really worth it to have like that much of a percentage of a reduction or not? And the additional thing that we found when digging in is it's actually really hard to find a lot of like quantitative, like high monetary impact incidents that involved open source. It's really easy to find it with closed source or proprietary software, but it's actually kind of hard with open source. So again, that's what made me think like, okay, there's some sort of dynamic going on here. It feels like it's being scapegoated a bit. So let's like bring in more of this context to kind of clarify the situation.
Yeah, you touch on a few points that we'll be touching on in a moment about the federal contractor ecosystem and, national security implications and things like that. But another thing, I've been writing and talking about software supply chain and security quite a bit in the last couple of years. And I feel like the whole ecosystem has hyper-focused on open source software. But if you look at the latest big breaches of the last year or so, it's not some obscure open source software library or component or project. It's the Microsofts, the Oktas, and on and on and on, right? So, why do you think the ecosystem has kind of hyper focused on open source? Is it just simply the scapegoat factor that you brought up? And then, I did want to throw out one little anecdote. You talked about, federal contractors integrating open source software in their products and not really being responsible for it. One glimmer of hope is OMB has a couple memos out there right now that they're pushing out, to software suppliers that sell to the federal government. And in there is language around being responsible for the open source software components you decide to put in your product. So you can't just kind of pass the blame on the open source software maintainer or contributor. But back to your previous point, you cite things from DBIR, you talk about Log4j and the impacts, and you have metrics to support that. Why the focus and demonization of open source software when really it's proprietary vendors who are really having the biggest breaches that have the biggest impact?
I'm trying to decide how spicy I want to go here. Well, for one, open source maintainers don't really unify together to fund like a lobbying effort. It's not like a bunch of open source people come together and are like, haha, yes, we're going to influence like federal representatives, right? It is very easy for proprietary vendors to do that. They actually have budgets for that kind of influence. So I think that's part of the problem. I think there's a kind of like, there's a more general bias that I think it's kind of a tragedy of the commons thing, but there's a kind of fundamental human tendency when something is given away for free, we tend to value it less. I'm sure any sales or marketing person who's listening has like heard all about the psychology of this, right? There's like a very real thing where like, if something is more expensive, we just assume it's higher quality. And if it's free, we're like, is it actually good? Right? Like free is in like, I mean, there are all sorts of analogies there, but the thing that comes to mind is like New York City, like a free couch. You're not going to get a free couch off the street, right? So the thing is like a lot of open source software is pretty high quality, and the community efforts, again, are honestly astonishing in how quickly that they are able to respond when there are vulnerabilities. In particular, like we looked at the Python ecosystem and like actually how good their governance is and their kind of like screening and filtering. A lot is really positive. So I think part of the problem is, yes, there is a huge incentive to blame open source for obvious reasons. Open source doesn't really have a voice because it's a very like kind of like disparate distributed collection of individuals or groups. There's the whole psychological thing of like getting it for free. And I think honestly, it's that the open source maintainer community and the like federal cybering community is pretty disparate, right? And so I think there's just a lot of misunderstanding. It kind of feels like there are a lot of like, Adrian Sanabria talked about this, about like myths in InfoSec that end up getting repeated. There are a lot of those kind of myths that I've seen over the years where it's like people say, like open source security is like, or open source is insecure and it's a problem. Then people just take that for fact. And because they hear it about, there's a very real cognitive bias with this. When we hear things a lot, it becomes more memorable and we assume it's true, even if we've never actually seen the evidence. So I think that's part of it. I think there are a lot of things basically that result in open source being kind of like stigmatized and scapegoated. But I think one of the biggest things for sure is that there is just a huge kind of like monetary incentive to blame open source rather than being like, yep, you're right, our software security practices weren't up to snuff, you shouldn't renew your contract. Like, what vendor is going to say that, right?
Yeah, I think you kind of point to what Ryan was talking about. It's like open source isn't necessarily like this tangible thing. It's an opaque ecosystem that you can kind of point your finger at it because you're not really pointing your finger at one single entity, or it's just kind of this ecosystem of stakeholders and contributors and maintainers and so on. So I want to ask you, Ryan, coming from the development perspective, for example, you guys talk about, taking a systems thinking approach, which, I talked about is kind of no surprise given Kelly's book, this security chaos engineering book, for example. But you talk about kind of having the systems thinking approach versus granular component kind of myopic focus that we see in a lot of dialogue right now around software supply chain security. You want to touch on that topic and why the systems thinking approach is a better approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe somewhat related to that is a point that Kelly made earlier around owning your dependencies. And I think that kind of is like one facet of a larger thing, which is, I work with engineering teams, I've worked in a few different industries, and like, if there's one thing that's like consistent between them, which is like people care about your system and they care about it functioning correctly, right? It's there to do whatever the business function is, right? And it doesn't matter how it's built internally or what components it's made up of or how they're assembled, right? What matters is like getting the work done. And so like you kind of like, if you start there, it leads to a systems thinking, right? You have to think about the whole system because your uptime is, related to security bugs. It's related to, whoopsies during deploys. It's related to infrastructure failures. It's related to network outages. There are so many things that can, sort of impact the availability of the system. And if you're not thinking about it from a systems perspective, you're just missing out on so much perspective. And fact is, there are so many different things that could possibly happen to cause downtime, to cause your system to go down that you can't realistically address all of them, right? You need to be thinking about like, oh, what can reasonably happen? How do I deal with it? How do I do it in a repeatable fashion? How do I do it as my team is changing, right? As new people are joining, as people are leaving, maybe people make mistakes. But like all of that is part of the software process, right? And it's actually a living system, right? It's a living system with people over time interacting with it. And so if you're thinking like component by component, oh, let's make sure all of the parts are secure, right? Like maybe each of the parts are secure, but they're not assembled in a secure way, or the configuration is wrong, or we made our storage bucket world readable, right? There's so many things where if you're not thinking about the whole system, you just miss it. You're not thinking in a way that is going to represent security or resilience or uptime in the ways you should.
Anything to add on that one, Kelly?
Yeah, I think kind of like what Ryan said, right? Like you could have like a secure database or like a secure web app, but then the connection between them isn't, and you might just miss that because you're like, well, there are no vulnerabilities in either. And it's like, again, like there might be on the authenticated access. It's like at a certain point, you do just have to think about it in terms of outcomes, like what can the attacker actually achieve, right? It's I've talked a lot about these kind of like runtime characteristics that help with security. We talk about this as well, right? It's like, sure, you can whack-a-mole vulnerabilities all you want. There will always be new ones, whether that's due to developer mistakes or just like, again, like something that was overlooked potentially for decades, like in an open source component. But like, if your service is like immutable or ephemeral once it's deployed, it really doesn't matter if there's a bug in it. And again, if we care about like reducing systemic impacts, which it seems like that's kind of the goal of the RFI, is like we don't want some sort of like socioeconomic harm, then that means like we want to contain impact, and that isn't from eliminating the vulnerabilities. That can be a source of that impact, but it's not the only thing. But having something where it's like, yeah, you can kill and restart a service on demand to like get it healthy again, that is something that very meaningfully solves for that problem in a way that like scanning for all the vulnerabilities, or again, like the SBOMs, right? Sure, you get this like huge, like enormous list of like JSON blobs about all of the software components, but like, how does that actually help you take action when something goes wrong? How do you know which of your log4j instances is actually accessible? How do you know which ones are like actually vulnerable? Like you may have like custom configurations. You may have like forked that open source component, like added something special to it. There's a lot of that context that, again, you really only, I guess, somewhat ironically get when you think about this and like how everything works together. And that's ultimately, again, what the attacker can do is very much how things interact together. They don't really care about like each individual component. It's very much, they think about it in terms of like, well, I can get access here and can I pivot here? It's all about like how they can kind of navigate throughout the whole thing to get their goal. And again, I feel like you lose sight of it when you start to go basically down a checklist of like, well, we're secure because we vulnerability scanned every single, like, I don't know, like server we have. Yeah, but so what? Like that doesn't mean anything real. So I don't know. I that is, it kind of goes back to my earlier point too, that component focus is very, very convenient for vendors. Because that is something that they can provide, and they can provide that like long list of things that generally the security team throws over the wall to the engineering team. The engineering team's like, great, there are like a million items on here which matter. Security team's like, good luck. bye, got to do other stuff. And the security vendor makes money. It is much harder to make lots of money off of like understanding the system as a whole, tracking data flows. And frankly, those aren't security tools. Those are like observability tools and other tools that exist on the software engineering side. And as a kind of related point, that's something we tried to point out, is a lot of the tools potentially that would actually make a difference in this problem are not in the cybersecurity industry. And to avoid regulatory capture, we need to make sure we are not just optimizing for what's available in the cybersecurity industry itself. What matters is the outcome, right?
Yeah, a lot of great points there. A little plug, you know, for the DIE triad. I don't know if Sunil created that, but first I heard of it was one of his talks. It distributed immutable ephemeral kind of triad rather than the legacy kind of CIA triad that we think about from cybersecurity perspective. And you also talked about something I've been really passionate about lately is like the need to provide context to engineering and development teams rather than just dumping these long lists of, you know, no context vulnerabilities on them and tell them, hey, you got to fix all the highs and criticals before you go to prod or something, you know, nonsensical like that. And you also kind of made me think of the old adage of, you know, people have heard like, you know, defenders thinking lists and attackers thinking graphs, the vulnerability list versus actual like lateral movement and what they can do within an environment. So a lot of great points there. You talked about eliminating vulnerabilities, for example. In the paper, you also touch on, you know, memory safe programming languages. And we've seen a push from, you know, NSA and CISA and others for the adoption of, you know, memory safe programming languages and moving to those. You know, for folks not familiar with that, what exactly does that mean? And then, you know, what are some of the opportunities and challenges that you all pointed out in the paper around, you know, memory safe programming languages?
I always struggle at what level to explain memory safety because I never know what the audience is. I think maybe sort of a generic way to explain it is when you have memory safety, you can reason about parts of your program in an isolated fashion because they won't have sort of like a behind the scenes, like spooky action at a distance sort of behavior. That's obviously not the technical definition, right? There's like a precise way that programs operate on real machines and sort of a semantic model of how the textual language gets converted into machine code, right? But if you're thinking about it from someone who's like never written code, right? You know, and want to wrap your head around this concept, right? It's, you know, thinking about memory and that like translation of code into machine code, it's just too complicated, you know, but this idea that you can like have parts of your program that like only interact with themselves, right? And you can kind of rely on that. That's really important for writing reliable software, right? It's really important for understandability of like, what is my code going to do, right? And it's very important for security because, you know, if you can have one part of the program interacting with other parts sort of like maliciously, it's really hard to like have any security properties maintained throughout the execution of the program. So that's kind of it. We, you know, one of the challenges with memory safety is the techniques that we use to implement it had overheads, right? And so this is why we have some systems that are built in memory unsafe language. Is usually systems that need high performance or need to interact directly with the machine, right? And then we have systems that, you know, maybe don't care about performance as much or higher level. They don't need to directly interact with the bits on the machine. We can build them in memory safe languages. What's happened recently is, you know, the rise of Rust, which is a memory safe language that takes a new approach to getting safety, right? It uses some complex proofs about your code to ensure that the memory that it's accessing is being done in a safe way. And so that is in fact the big thing, and that's why so much of the software community is obsessed with this language.
Yeah, very cool. I dropped a link to a paper from NSA on memory safety that folks, you know, may find interesting with some details on the topic. But I also want to ask Kelly, I suspect, you know, some of your commentary was coming through in this section because it talks about, you know, the incentives and it talks about not being technical. It talks about social constraints in terms of refactoring and you know, velocity and the development team's priorities and so on. So I'm curious your thoughts on that topic of memory safety before we move on from that one too.
Yeah, I mean, listen, refactoring is not easy. I think anyone who's been in a software organization, especially on like a software engineering team where you have to like refactor your code base, even if it's not into a new language, it's just like cleaning it up. It can be a quagmire, not just technically, but certainly socially. There's a real phenomenon where it's like maybe the code base, it's like someone's baby, or you don't have the organizational knowledge and you have to hire new people, or the people who did understand the system enough to guide a refactor are no longer there. Like, there's so many things that can make it kind of a challenging proposition. I see a lot of companies try to do like the big bang rewrite where they try to do everything all at once. That rarely works out. Iterative change is always much better. So one of the things we wanted to temper is like, yes, memory safety. Like, both of us were like, yes, Rust is great. We should refactor to memory safe languages wherever we can. Realistically, there are a lot of organizations that, for a variety of reasons, the constraints they face, it means that they can't refactor, at least not immediately. It could take decades. There's a lot of like legacy code out there. And legacy, I don't think, is inherently bad. It just means often there's pre-existing code that has maybe calcified somewhat against some customers, or like, you will not change this code base, right? And they could be paying juicy contracts. Like, there are a bunch of reasons why it might be hard to change. So we wanted to make sure that like it's a yes and thing. We're like, yes, we need to recommend memory safe languages, especially any new code written. Definitely, I think the federal government can incentivize with their own contractor base, like, don't write it in C or C++. Like, it has to be in something new. For existing code, given that will take time, there are other things that or other mitigations that companies can put in place and kind of like stop gaps in the meantime to make sure that, while they kind of plan out the larger initiative that is the big refactor, again, ideally iterative, they can still kind of like reduce the hazards that are involved and ideally minimize the impact if an attacker exploits the code. And frankly, a lot of the things that we suggest are really useful just to minimize the impact of like performance issues in memory. Because I think some people in cybersecurity don't realize that memory unsafety is actually kind of unpopular with developers because it can lead to performance issues as well. So there's good momentum kind of from multiple fronts behind it. But yeah, it's very much taking a realistic lens. Like, not every company is going to be able to do this overnight, so they need to be able to do other things in the meantime.
Yeah, I think it was a practical take, dealing with the constraints of not only the technical constraints, but the social constraints of, competing priorities, finite resources, things like that as well. Another thing you all touched on that I want to touch on with you, and we've talked about this a little bit already, is kind of the free riding, concept of open source software that happens in the ecosystem. You specifically call out, federal contractors who are selling software to the federal government, and maybe they're not contributing back to the open source software ecosystem that they're using, when it comes to libraries, components, projects, et cetera. And you said there's the potential basically for the government to require contractors to fund parts of the open source software ecosystem that they're using in the software they sell to the government. So I'm curious your take here, because I'm not against this recommendation. I think it's a good one, but also I think the same could be said. Say we're talking about the Booz Allen Hamiltons, the SAICs, the KDIT, whomever, right? These large contracting companies that, do software for the government. The same could be said for commercial software vendors that are selling to the federal government too. I suspect they likely are largely using open source software and using it in the products that ultimately make it to the federal marketplace. Couldn't the same be said, for both software vendors like government contractors, but also commercial suppliers as well? Hopefully that makes some sense.
It makes total sense, yes. And I realize probably we messed up our verbiage, because to us, anyone selling into the federal government was a federal contractor, not just, like you said, the SAICs of the world, right? All of the, what is it, that one area in Maryland and Virginia or whatever, where they all have their offices. Yeah, we viewed it as anyone selling to the federal government is someone that would be under this purview, right? So absolutely, if you have some sort of commercial, I'm just going to choose like a Cisco just because they're huge. I'm guessing they sell to the federal government because they make like however many billions, or a Microsoft, right? Like, those would absolutely be under this purview. If they're selling into federal agencies, it seems very reasonable that federal agencies could ask any of their suppliers to fund the open source projects that they're using when they deliver the software. So that's probably us missing the nuance.
No, that makes sense. I figured that's what you meant. I just wanted to make sure, because I was going to say it kind of applies to anyone selling to the federal market. So that makes
Definitely.
sense. Yeah. So you also touch on, maybe this is one to kick off with Ryan, but you touch on the workforce as well. You kind of touch on the fact, you come from a technical background, right? And you guys touch on the fact that, there's challenges around the federal government attracting and retaining technical talent, but you talked about the potential for them to maybe pay better, have better compensation and maybe bring some more development in-house, right? Historically, it's kind of grown that they just outsource all of this, to system integrators, federal contractors, whomever, right? And I think Kelly's, chomping at the bit to weigh in on this one too. But, can you touch on your recommendations there around the workforce and compensation and things like that too, in terms of in-house software development?
I will let Ryan go. This was my hobby horse, so I will take it. So to me, there's a slightly absurd thing in my mind where it's I think we stated pretty strongly in the paper where it's okay, on the one hand, you have just the private market incentive, right, which is generally towards profit or growth or whatever, some sort of monetary thing generally. And then you have a national security interest where you get these huge budgets just to pursue that. And you don't really have to, you kind of prove ROI, but national security is a very squishy sort of thing to quantify, right? Those two are often at odds, right? Because it's hard to achieve growth when you're in the ultimate kind of security mindset where everything is potentially classified. They're just very, I think, antithetical in many cases. A lean, scrappy startup is not going to be intelligence community ready. So to me, it's one of the things they asked, for those of you who didn't read the RFI, was to come up with Gordian knots where things were kind of looking at it from an alternative perspective, what are some solutions that may not be obvious? And to me, one of the key things, if you just really zoom out and look at the incentives, is okay, if you have such specific requirements that the private industry is just in no way incentivized to meet, either, yes, you can impose your requirements on literally the whole ecosystem and slow everyone down and hurt all of their goals around growth, or you could just build it yourself to your own requirements, right? There's certainly banks famous in New York City for doing that, where they use some open source tools, but they also build a lot of tools themselves because they know that most commercial vendors would not want to implement what they need. And I feel it's almost to the ad absurdum level of that in the federal government. So that was one of my things, is really, if we want the changes, the federal government clearly is unhappy with the level of security in whatever software they're receiving, right? And right now they're kind of at the mercy of that because for the past, since the 1980s, there's been a big push to privatize all of that work, including software development. It just seems like a kind of elegant solution is being able to hire people to build this stuff in-house, and that way you can make sure the buck stops with you, right? Any insecurities from your own efforts, and you can invest kind of as much as you want rather than having to drag your suppliers along into satisfying things. So that was my big, I know it's an ambitious thing that probably won't happen, but really it should. And I think everybody would be much happier if that happened too.
Over to you, Ryan, on that one. I wanted to give you a chance too.
Sure. I mean, you asked an economic question and then kicked it over to me, which Kelly has to answer that one, right? So, but yeah, I mean, all of what Kelly said is true. I think the one bit that I would add is if you've ever had to hire software engineers and you've had to do it on a budget, you'd know software engineers, they are high paid professionals. And if I had to hire software engineers on the budgets that the federal schedule salary, I forget what the name is, but if you had to hire on that budget, it would just be hard. And what you're going to end up with is people who are effectively giving their labor away for below cost because they want to work for the federal government. I think that is a big ask of people, right? You have to really want to do it. And so maybe we need to re-examine, what that pay structure looks like. Otherwise, let's just be frank, the government is going to have a lot of trouble attracting talent.
Yeah, you're spot on. I've been a federal employee both in and out of uniform, and I've seen many exceptionally talented people leave to the private sector because they need to earn more money. I mean, it's just the reality of it. And I think that's, it's kind of interesting because on one hand, the federal government, like you talked about earlier, has this massive budget and the ability to make these long-term contracts and these big, compensation deals in some cases, or not compensation, but, procurements, for example. But also when it comes to individual, resources and salaries, it's constrained in a lot of ways. So I thought that section of the paper was great. Another thing I wanted to touch on with you all is, you talked about, the ability to use velocity of CI/CD to lead to substantial resilience and security benefits. And this is, backed up by things like State of DevOps report and DORA metrics and all those kind of things as well. And I spent a lot of time in the federal sector still, working myself. And, due to something that Kelly talked about, is like it's hard to quantify national security. There's a lot of risk aversion, in terms of velocity. Like when it comes to CI/CD and pushing changes out fast to production, everyone wants to have their hands in everything and touch everything and slow things down and kind of, have this control over things. And they're afraid to let things kind of move fast in a lot of cases. So how do we kind of get the federal ecosystem to mature in this regard and understand that velocity and pushing software faster has security and resilience benefits, instead of thinking that if they just control everything and slow everything down, everything will be safe and secure and they can feel warm and comfortable?
Yeah, the way this is sometimes played out, and Dr. Forsgren would be definitely a great person to talk about this directly, but the way that I've certainly seen it played out is in very conservative organizations, often highly regulated. You're right. Federal government is obviously the extreme of that, but they are worried that if they move quickly, things are just going to break. And the thing is, yes, if they kept everything the same as it is right now and they tried to move quickly, everything would break, right? Because what Dr. Forsgren's found repeatedly is that when you have like bigger, bulky changes, like again, the Big Bang thing, right? You've got a bunch more stuff in there that's hard to analyze. It's hard to figure out. It's hard to like unwind if something goes wrong. There's a lot of hazard wrapped up in that, right? But when you enable the ability to move quickly, and I know I have like CI/CD from my blog, for instance, it's not like I don't worry so much. There's the classic thing, right? You release like a blog or you write an email and you discover the typo after, because of course you do. Being able to make the change quickly, right? It actually reduces, I'm like, oh, okay, it's not so bad. I can like change it quickly, right? It doesn't have to be this big fraud thing when you release it. That's obviously a trivial example, but yeah, the ability to release changes on demand means that you can patch on demand and you can upgrade on demand. You can deploy other security fixes on demand. You can tweak your allow lists or block lists on demand as well. There's so many security things that become much easier once you start making those workflows like automated and repeatable. Yes, you are giving up some sort of control, right? Because you're not manually doing it, but also you don't have to worry about making mistakes as much either, because they're much easier to like roll back and fix. So there is a trade-off there. And what the evidence shows is that companies that decide to make that trade-off and move more quickly overwhelmingly have lower change fail rates, and they have lower, they're able to recover from incidents more quickly, right? Basically speed and stability are correlated. And I know that is uncomfortable and counterintuitive to a lot of people. And a lot of times what it takes is having like one kind of like pod almost within an organization to try it out and prove it out. I know some organizations where they let like one part of the R&D team just start playing around with serverless and again, CI/CD, and they saw like, oh, actually, this is fine. In fact, they have like better reliability or better security outcomes than kind of our traditional, monolith and heavy manual processes, right? So I feel like you kind of have to see it to believe it. Like you can hear this evidence, you may not, but I'm hoping that what we wrote about and providing that evidence inspires the federal government to maybe at least try it out somewhere, like maybe 18F. I don't know, maybe they're already doing that, but somewhere to see like, okay, let's just see if that works for us. And it does take, in some cases, I feel like it's not a total leap of faith because you have pretty heavy guardrail. You've got like what is it like for stunts? They have that like squishy mat that you fall on. I feel like CI/CD is more like that than like jumping off a cliff. But yeah, organizations who end up kind of pursuing that approach, like what I've seen time and time again is because they don't have to worry about like that reliability and stability and security as much because they have it more automated. And ironically, again, it's more under their control because they can change things when they need to. They're able to start doing way more innovative things, right? They're able to get into like the really cool, like security mitigations or other things, like even things like resilience stress tests, right? Because they have all of that just kind of like basic stuff handled, and it's really empowering. So unfortunately, again, CI/CD as a thing doesn't really have a lot of like muscle behind it in terms of lobbying because it's a practice, and that's the problem. Whether it's open source or practices, it's just like these are these more kind of like abstract concepts or ideas, and again, like it's there's no one wanting to lobby for it really. So it's a lot easier to be like, yeah, you just bolt on this zero trust, whatever solution and your problems are solved, rather than like, oh, you have to change your practices. Even though the former won't actually result in better outcomes, while the latter will.
Yeah, I think of it kind of like a muscle, in the sense that if you practice it, it gets stronger. And, if you don't, it kind of atrophies. And that's what you talked about with kind of these big bang deployments, is everything is kind of just held and held. And then finally something's done. Like in the ecosystem of federal space so far where I have, worked, there's a lot of pockets of innovation, people that are pushing these kind of methodologies and these mindsets that you're talking about. But the larger ecosystem is still very uncomfortable with the concepts of moving fast and deploying frequently and things like that. And there's a lot of CI, not a lot of CD. It's the kind of the way it exists right now. And then, so you mentioned resilient stress testing. I wanted to, maybe kick it to you a little bit, Ryan, on this one. Similarly in this system, people tend to do like a lot of table topping, hypothetical, thought exercises, but not a lot of actual stress testing of the system, for the same reason that they're concerned about something breaking or having an impact. As a security engineer, for example, like how have you kind of helped organizations adopt this and see the value of it without, being scared to do so?
I mean, I have an averse reaction to being called a security engineer. I haven't been involved in tabletoping and all of those sorts of practices. And my perspective is coming at it from someone who is building a system that, like, the value is it's working, right? And so I don't know, I feel like the like science-based approach of let's try to understand the system, let's try to understand what things could disrupt it, right? And test it out and see, like, how is the system going to behave, right? And if it doesn't behave how we expect, what should we do about it, right? Should we fix the bug? Should we change our architecture? Should we, add mitigations? Should we isolate systems, right? There's so many things you could do. And I feel like, that is a healthy way to look at sort of an evolving process, right? An evolving system. And so Kelly has put a whole ton of work into the book. I won't, Kelly can go into extreme detail on exactly what resilient stress testing is, but just like from a high level perspective, right? You need to be testing your system. You need to be validating your hypotheses and feeding back into the CI/CD parts, right? To the extent that you can automate and like put these things in place so humans don't have to like think about them until the constraint is violated. That just like gets you moving quicker, right? You can stop worrying about the toil of all these little things that you've tested and automated and validated. And should your assumption ever not prove true, the system will tell you, and you can jump in and fix it before your next release.
Yeah, I agree. Well said. So definitely a plug for the book. I'll drop another comment with the link to the book. We couldn't make it out of here without mentioning SBOM, software bill of materials. For folks not familiar with it, it's kind of a nested inventory of software components in an application, for example, or a product. You guys, come pretty hard at the concept of SBOM in the paper, and even kind of saying some vendors are going to kind of have an adverse reaction to the, kind of calling out the SBOM's value proposition. But from the software supply chain concept, you talk about SolarWinds, Colonial, Exchange, etc. That SBOM wouldn't have prevented these things. When we talk about software supply chain security, why do you think the industry, even obviously the federal government, but more broadly the industry as a whole, has hyper focused on SBOM over things like secure software development practices and other things that are critical, like we're talking about with CI/CD and resilient stress testing and so on? What's with this hyper focus on SBOM? Why do you think that is?
I have a very spicy answer. Again, I never, when I say these things, I never assume that anyone is like, haha, I'm going to be like maliciously plotting how to avoid accountability. I think it's a natural human thing to like feel scared about having responsibility for something as big as like the software supply chain. That's like a huge responsibility. So I think it's natural to gravitate towards things that, theater, basically, where it looks like, oh, wow, we're putting in so much work. It's very elaborate. Look at this like long list of things that we've identified. And then it's like, okay, so what do you do with it? And they're like, what do you mean? Just a legitimate conversation I've had, by the way, with an SBOM person. And it's like, well, you have the list of things. It's like the thing with the vulnerable thing. I'm like, yeah, but what do you do with it? How do you even know that the thing with the vulnerable thing is even like connected to the internet? Like, in which case, who cares? You're just going to waste your time, right? And like, to Ryan's point, like, how do you know that like the implementation of these things is either secure or maybe not so secure? So I think it's part of the self-perpetuating thing that I talked about, where there was kind of an appeal to authority with like SBOMs are the answer. And I didn't see a lot of challenging why. And when I dug into it, I was like, this doesn't seem to actually solve anything other than like, in theory, just more data. And like, I don't think data is necessarily the problem all the time. I mean, I heard of a lot of engineering teams that were the ones who came up with the list of like resources that were affected by Log4j, right? Like they already have a lot of answers to this. So in some sense, it's kind of like recreating some of the systems we already have. And then, I don't know, I honestly, I feel like a lot of it is security people, because any human doesn't like feeling like they're helpless. And I think there's a natural tendency to feel a little helpless in the face, again, of this really big problem. SBOMs are great. It's honestly, I will give it credit for being an elegant solution for feeling like you have control when you absolutely do not have control. Because again, you get this long list of things that you probably won't read. That's going to be difficult to ingest. Again, it's creating a whole roster of tools, which I'll leave that kind of symbiotic relationship aside. But you also aren't responsible for it, right? Like you create the SBOM list and you aren't accountable for those systems. You're not the one deploying it, and you're not the one maintaining, you're not doing the ops on it or like all the SRE work. So it's easy for you to be like, yeah, we'll implement SBOMs. Those are very important, probably hard to rip out. And so kind of we're going to be useful into perpetuity because we're the managers of the system. And we also don't have to deal with the fallout. So in economics, there's the principal agent problem where like there's someone basically, it's common in insurance, right? Where it's like you insure someone who ends up being like reckless because they have the insurance. It's kind of like that, where it's like a lot of security teams, what I see today is they're often really, really honestly reckless with like developer productivity because they don't have to, they're the ones interacting with the tools they buy, and sometimes they don't even implement it themselves even. So to me, it's SBOMs is just like, yeah, we're doing something about the problem. Look at us. It's like innovative, except not like this is a really old idea. And to be honest, whenever I hear SBOMs come up outside of cybersecurity, and even in cybersecurity, sometimes it's treated like a joke. Like it's kind of like they're kidding, right? Like, and so the more and more they push it, kind of the less seriously they're taken about actually wanting to solve the software security problem, which is why I think we use the word like the government needs to forsake this crusade, because it's generally causing people to question like where do their kind of loyalties lie. Is this they're looking for consulting gigs after the fact to help with SBOMs because they're kind of creating the problem to be solved? By the way, this is not a dig on cybersecurity because this happens all the time in the finance industry, right? People go to the SEC, create new regulations and other new things, and they'll come back to the big banks and make money solving the exact problem they created. And are they trying to remunerate other vendors that are able to create like the SBOM solutions, right? So I think there's a genuine question, like, if no one can figure out how to actually make it actionable outside of the like, well, we have all these JSON blobs, like, why are they pushing it so hard? No one can answer that. I've never heard a satisfactory answer, and people get very offended when you even question the utility of the SBOM, which to me is always a red flag. Like people get mad when you're like, well, why is this useful? You never hear like DevOps people get mad, like, why is CI/CD useful? They're always generally excited to tell you, and they can get very concrete with how it's useful, right? Yeah, SBOM, it feels a bit like a cult, and I'm hoping the genie can be put back in the bottle, because honestly, what I'm worried about is SBOMs are non-trivial to manage. Like there is a serious impact it's going to have on developer velocity. It's going to have a serious impact on how software is like built and managed, because if engineering teams know that they're going to have to deal with like all the SBOM BS, like they're definitely going to change things. And I don't think it's going to be for the better necessarily, because it's not even about like managing dependencies, because you can have a lot of dependencies, but if they're well vetted, like who cares? But I think they'll try to minimize the amount of stuff because they just don't want the JSON blobs to be longer. To be honest, I feel like there's just like this horrible incentive paradigm emerging. And what worries me is because the cybersecurity people have very little consequence from implementing this, especially the regulatory agents, because they're not gonna have to do this stuff in practice, right? It's not gonna be them. So I don't know, to me, it's like an incentive disaster. And it's honestly a little astonishing that it's gotten this far without anyone asking for real world evidence of how it helps. That was quite a rant, but
yeah, no,
Ryan,
no,
do you have anything to
totally
add?
fine. I think, I'll be honest, I agree and disagree with some of the aspects of that. I think that, for example, not the SBOM itself, but transparency could be useful, like we talked about earlier, to understand the open source software components that a vendor is using in the software they sell to the government, or like there could be value in certain other areas. But you're spot on in the sense that, like, I think security doesn't have to deal with the consequences of dragging down developer velocity, right? Or driving business outcomes, slowing them down. Despite all the talk of security being a business enabler, right? We're often doing exactly the opposite in many cases. And we are coming up on time, so I want to be respectful of both of your time and the audience's time. Last question for you all. A couple minutes here from each of you. As we look forward to the future here, a couple years out or whatever, where do you see the future of open source software security headed? And do you think the government will have a positive impact or a negative impact, or a bit of both? Where do you see some big changes headed?
Ryan, I'll let you go because I just had a long rant.
Yeah, and I do love the rant. The rants are great. I guess reading the RFI, I was most worried that the government would put in heavy-handed regulation. What I would actually like to see is more involvement from vendors and interested parties in the ecosystem itself, right? So don't ask us to do things. Get involved, write the software, fix the bugs, fund the organizations that need funding and can hire people to work on their open source projects, as their full-time gig. I think that would make the ecosystem a lot healthier. And then I guess the other aspect is a lot like we talked about SBOMs, right? And SBOMs is the security community deluding themselves into thinking that they have a solution for this problem. And actually the solution is like engineers need to do engineering work to keep their dependencies up to date, to find security vulnerabilities and address them, right? How do we incentivize that engineering work? How do we make it easier? How do we make it quicker? And so I think solutions that go in that direction are going to be great. And I'm not sure what role the federal government has to play in that. I would like for it to be a positive one.
How about you, Kelly? Any kind of final parting thoughts or commentary from you?
No, I think that's right. It's all about incentives. And I hope the federal government doesn't, get huge overreach, because I think there would be a period of time, where we could look back 30 years from now and be like, wow, the United States really wasted its advantage that we had in being kind of the nexus of open source software. Like, there's a huge global community, obviously, but like the United States drives a lot of it. And we would just very genuinely lose competitiveness, and kind of for what, right? And I think, there's a lot of compliance stuff that's been looked back at pretty unfavorably. I think some of the stuff that you could do in open source would be even worse for that. And I think, again, it's kind of like I said, putting the genie back in the bottle. I think there is a point at which like it kind of has permanent effects that I hope we could avoid. So I don't know. I think it's, like Ryan said, I think the federal government can absolutely start with its own like supplier base and incentivizing these better practices, putting out recommendations around memory safety has been great. I think really getting more practical and like how supporting companies like actually refactoring, like showing case studies. I think that's a lot of times what's missing from the federal government, is just like show how they helped a supplier like refactor their code base into a memory safe language, right? Like show how it works in practice, because a lot of times it's very like draw the owl vibes. So I think that would be much more helpful than, again, I'm going to beat a dead horse. That's going to be more helpful than SBOMs, is showing in practice, how do you like refactor? How do you implement these practices?
Yeah, well said. And this has been an excellent conversation. For folks that haven't read the RFI from the Office of National Cyber Director, definitely go check it out, and then definitely check out Ryan and Kelly's paper. And I just wanted to emphasize one thing she said is, one key here is we don't want to erode our competitive advantage with other nations. When we look at, technology, it's increasingly playing a role in everything from our critical infrastructure to our national security. It's absolutely critical. So I have the same concerns, and I hope that we see the right path forward taken by us as a nation. That said, Kelly and Ryan, thanks for jumping on with me and kind of, chatting through all these things, and everyone have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.